Some of the first work I did as a social psychologist is studying people who are experts at things and what their bodies look like when they're doing the thing that they're good at. Down to a biological level, the people who have practiced, who are good at the thing, show a state of challenge physiologically when they're doing it. The people who haven't done that show a state of threat. And so the only way to get into that state of challenge is by practice. You cannot intellectualize it. Your body will not align with what you need it physiologically for you to be good at it unless you practice. And I'm talking about the below the neck, blood pressure, heart rate, sympathetic arousal. Those systems only respond the way you need them to when you have practiced. And there's no way of outsmarting that.
Dr. Tessa West, thank you for joining us. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Big fan of your work. It's going to resonate deeply with our audience, which is one of the reasons I was passionate about getting on the show. And yet, for the handful of folks who might not be familiar with you or your work, why don't you orient us a little bit as to a little bit about yourself, what you study, and I will lead us into the path with your new book. But talk to us about your course of study and your focus in your professional life.
Sure. So I am a social psychology professor at New York University, and I study uncomfortable interactions. So that is everything from walking into the doctor's office and having small talk to asking a boss for a raise to having a negotiation with someone who comes from a different country. Maybe you can't quite understand what they're trying to say through their accent. And so you're, super anxious the whole time. And what I've done kind of through the last 20 years is put people in these awkward situations, look at how they manage them with their behaviors and how those behaviors often are mismatched with their stress responses, their physiology, and then kind of applying some of those lessons around communication to the workplace, to understanding how we manage difficult conversations, to how we have career conversations, with people at work, with our network connections and with our bosses and so on. So I spent 20 years doing this, and I also teach romantic relationships, close relationships, and I try to kind of bring together all these different pieces to help people have difficult conversations in the workplace.
Amazing. Speaking of workplace, the people who listen to and watch this show are passionate about work. That is a really important piece of, I'll say career rather than work, but the orientation that we spend a lot of time, having to support ourselves. And so the belief that we ought to do things that we enjoy is a very popular sentiment here on the show. This is one of the reasons your new book caught my attention. It's called Job Therapy: Finding Work That Works for You. And I do feel like that has become a really important task here in the 21st century, like understanding what it is that we're good at doing, what we like to do, what will reward us, and yet also not becoming that, not having to have that identity. So what do you feel like, tell me if you feel like that resonates with the research. Is this just a feeling I have, and the people that are listening and watching are you're going to talk us out of it, or can you validate and lean into this sentiment that I'm feeling?
Yeah, I will validate and lean in, but I also want to point out that you said two things there that I found super interesting that were actually a little bit contradictory, which I think
Okay.
captures the vibe, which
Yep.
is we want to find work that we love, that we identify with. In fact, the first chapter of my book, Identity Crisis, is all about this person who they are as a person is tied
Mhm.
up to who they are in their career. And I think career
Mhm.
is the right word here. But at the same time, we're getting a lot of messages that our work shouldn't define us. Can't we have something outside of our work? We know that people can't retire because they can't let go of their career identities, and it ends up kind of being a little bit of a disaster for them. So we often talk out of both sides of our mouth. We want to find careers that we identify with, that we love, that bring us purpose, but not too much because we're afraid of being overly identified at work, that will negatively impact our well-being. And that's the tension that I try to kind of unpack in this book and try to get people to really process, because high achievers are constantly experiencing ambivalence between those two kinds of forces within them.
Yeah, and perhaps I was over indexing on that identity piece because as I was going back and reviewing my notes for our conversation today, that piece about identity, early on in the book really stands out to me. And I have found that perhaps, or not even perhaps, that I know in my own life that when other people know you as a thing, especially since we have Instagram handles and LinkedIn profiles and
Yeah.
whatnot, when you are known by, I would say, most of the people in your life, just as a bunch of bullet points in a bio or a description in a social thing, or because our digital footprint is usually much larger than our in real life footprint, there's
Yeah.
this tension, there's a conflict there of, um, actually, the kind of the way that I am with my friends is the way I am in real life, and the way that
Mhm.
our tech conversations look like. And it's not the stuff that I put out on social media or even here in the podcast. Maybe this little microphone is a little bit better at helping more personality come through, but how are we not reduced to a series of bullet points in our bio? And I think that's the tension that you were hearing in my voice earlier, I think, is an attempt to reconcile that stuff. And this is why, again, I'm sucked in by this identity piece that you write about in
Yeah.
the beginning of the book.
We all kind of struggle with this. And I have to say that kind of one finding from social psychology is that your friends, your family, and your coworkers actually see you much more similarly to each other than you realize.
Mm,
We think that the world is a stage and that we go home and we have our romantic relationships and then we go to our kids' soccer game and then we go to work and we're these different people wearing different outfits with different personalities. But if you ask all those people what they think of you, they tend to actually agree really highly with each other.
mm,
And so I think there is this thing about us where we try to have these separate worlds. We try to have what scientists call different contingencies of self worth. If I feel bad about myself because my boss yelled at me, I'm going to go feel good about myself at the gym or something like that. But in reality, they're all mushed together and it's almost impossible psychologically to pull them apart. And we see this a lot in the well being conversation where people talk about work life balance. And I'm like, if you're at home at dinner, perseverating on an email, you are not at work right now. You're still at work. And so there's so much overlap and messiness in all of these parts of ourselves that we think they ought to be separate, but the reality is they're just not. They're
mm.
all kind of mushed together, and I think that's why we struggle a lot with separating our career identities from the cool guy at the bar that has beers with their friends. I'm
Well,
never that cool person. I don't even try.
well, this is one of the things that I found interesting was you have, as an example, in the opening, a series of questions. Your work seems to be able to help people gravitate to the things that are, is it, would you use the words most natural or most well aligned? Um, is it more emotional or is it more logical and categorical? Like, how we think about your work relative to this conundrum that we're facing.
Yeah, I think that first off, I think we should embrace those emotions that you kind of ended with. That most of us who are good at our jobs think we got there because we made a million logical choices and smart ones. And when we're unhappy, we don't know how that happened because we were really utilitarian and we are super kind of programmatic in our approach. But the reality is, there's a bunch of emotions that underlie all that that we
Mm,
often kind of ignore, don't process. There's a lot of ambivalence in our emotions. So we expect because we made logical choices to go to a certain school or take a job, that those emotions will always sort of follow, that we'll feel good about those decisions. But most of us, even when we're super successful, have extreme ambivalence about our careers. We love it and we hate it at the same time.
mm,
And I think that mixed emotion puts us on a little bit of a roller coaster that we're not trained to expect, especially once we become experts and we don't know what to do with. We know what ambivalence feels like in romantic context, but we often don't get how can I be this successful and still love and hate this thing at the same time. And so I think that's kind of, if you're going to kind of really kind of zone in on one emotion, it's ambivalence. It's
mm.
hating and loving, wanting to go all in, wanting to pull out, feeling anxious, but also bored. Things that don't often kind of go together. Anxious boredom is a real thing, folks. Like, I think you all
Wow.
probably all know what that feels like, but
Wow.
these things don't normally get cooked up together in our minds. But I think a lot of people are feeling all of these things right now.
Well, one of the main lenses that I was reading your book through was the one that most of the people that are in the community that are listening and watching today, they are running from a job that they either have done for a long time because largely our community or our communities, I will say our culture is very much about sort of the starving artist and oh, being creative is nice, but you need to go get a real job.
Yeah.
All of those that programming, and so a lot of people, whether they're 20 or 45, have in some way taken a page out of the playbook that our parents gave us and our career counselors, tried that on, and it didn't work. So now they're running away from that thing toward what, again, the a more creative life, something that taps into the a lot of the idealistic view of what's possible with the life with your a small business owner, an entrepreneur, an artist. And so there's a little bit of a coming to something.
Yeah.
Now, this does not free us from that, for example, that ambivalence, this I love it and I hate it, because I love that I don't have a boss, for example, and I hate that I don't have anybody to tell me what to do because now I have to make all the decisions, right? So it's so tightly intertwined. I'm wondering, did you see anything in the research specifically about people who are, you talk a lot about not being appreciated at work, but what about, and how does that translate to the small business person, to the entrepreneur, the individual artist or creator?
Yeah, I think I love this question. I think most of us undervalue the importance of having a higher power, higher status person telling us what to do and then giving us certainty. And I think people who have made it and then decide to do something more entrepreneurial, more creative, they end up in a little bit of a decision paralysis because they're so used to this framework of if I do X, Y will happen, and therefore I will be successful, this kind of certainty path, that an entrepreneurial mindset is much more like there are a million forks in the road. At any given time, one of those forks could end up being a disaster. And guess what? You're not going to know until you're pretty far in. And so you have to have a stomach for uncertainty, a
Mhm.
stomach for though that roller coaster of not just your emotions but of your business model, and feeling like there is no kind of clear path to success. And that sounds trite and obvious, but I think for those of us who've been working for a really long time and we have status at work, we know exactly what it takes to keep that status and we know what it takes to make money and be successful. Now we feel like newbies, and it's kind of a gross, slightly embarrassing feeling for a lot of successful people to admit to themselves that they're not good at something, that they don't have stable status, and they don't actually know if I do XY will happen. And I think that is the struggle for a lot of people who are in this position, who have left those careers that they kind of, there's a concept called sliding versus deciding. They slid into an old career, they never decided on it. Now they want to decide, but they're totally scared of all of this, status loss and all that kind of messiness going on inside of them. But that's okay. That is a natural part of the process.
You've got a lot in the book about being underappreciated and overlooked at work. I'm wondering if you can map that onto this. Is there a similar set of a similar trap or a set of similar sort of paralysis when, for when you go out on your own or you are the only person in your solopreneurship journey, you don't have
Yeah.
a higher status person to coach you, or it just feels like so many people, they do feel underappreciated. They do feel like their work's not getting the right, light at the right time in the sunshine, or the right, light cast on it or whatnot. Are these the same feelings, the feelings that we have in a career, in a job environment versus in a small business or a a creative? Or this sort of feeling of under recognition, under
Yeah.
appreciation, being overlooked? Are they the same, two different sides of the same coin, or are they different?
I think they are, but I think that when you're starting your own business, It's a more difficult state because you don't have a finger to point. You can't actually blame one person, one boss, or one organization for that underappreciation, right? So when you're successful and you get passed up for a raise or promotion, you know whose fault it is, or at least you think you do. I mean, we often don't actually know. That's kind of one of the things I walk through in my book. But when you're starting your own business, you feel like you're not getting attention, but you don't know whose fault it is. And that might be your own fault. You don't know why people aren't like clicking on subscribe, or they're not purchasing your thing, or you're not getting that VC money you want. And there's a nebulousness that I think people really struggle with who are starting their own business, who are entrepreneurs, because they don't have a source. And that is kind of the biggest kind of existential struggle for people who are in that position, that I think is a little bit different than the kind of more clear cut problem of I'm underappreciated. Maybe there's no market for me, but clearly my boss doesn't appreciate me, or my boss's boss, or so on and so forth.
Mm. Yeah, this is just it's just such a clear pattern in the people that I listen to and talk to in our community of uh it's just like the where are my fans?
Yep.
How do I
Where
feel?
are they? Why isn't anyone paying attention to me? Where are you?
Exactly. So I feel like a lot of the feelings of being underappreciated, and when we put work out into the world that does not get recognized, it is in part because we haven't built a community, we haven't networked, we haven't
Yeah.
done that work. We do it at a job fair or to get a job, but as soon as we go out on our own, we don't feel like, we feel like the work's supposed to stand on its own, and that's just not
Yeah.
true. What's your thoughts on that?
Gosh, I mean, I'm as a author of trade books, going from a successful academic career to then wanting people just to read my book. Like, why aren't they just doing it? There's a conversion problem I think people struggle with, which is why aren't my old skills, why aren't my old accomplishments converting to this new thing and the way that I would expect it to? And I think that's where it really comes down to figuring out who do you need to network with, who do you need to get to actually publicly support your stuff, and then getting over this cringe factor of actually explicitly asking people to promote you. And I think for me that was it's a struggle every day as an academic. Doing that is non-normative, it's gross. You don't ask people to send out your paper for people to read. That would be a totally weird sort of violation of the norms of the industry. But then when you start your own thing, or for me, writing books, you do have to like actually write those messages where you say, if I send you a book, will you take a photo with it and post it on social media? And I think those kinds of behaviors are actually critical to convert your talent into actually getting noticed. And you have to get certain kinds of, influencers or whatever to do it. But we don't like asking that. We feel gross about it, and we don't even know how to network and have conversations with strangers in a way that doesn't feel so transactional. And I think, one of the main lessons I learned in this book is you have to build those networks just by asking people to talk about themselves first. Spend 15 minutes of saying, tell me about your career, how you got here, and don't ask anything yet. You can't jump in with an ask. You kind of lead that after the relationships develop, but it does take a series of one-on-one 15-minute conversations to do that. And that's something that a lot of us who are experts just aren't used to doing with complete strangers outside of our industry.
Yeah. So say more about that, because most people, we don't get 15 minutes with somebody else. And a lot of the relationships are online and are not based in real life, especially as we grow, a worldwide appreciation for our photography, our design skills, and in a universe where social media has allowed us to reach broader audiences, the ability to authentically connect seems dramatically reduced.
Yeah, I think I mean, I'm old school. I'm one of those people who I study
No,
interpersonal
I'm with
interaction.
you.
And yeah, the boomers have something on us, which is they sort of hate this transactional nature of networking and developing relationships. You still do need to do some of that. And if that means DMing someone and, having a text conversation on that medium, that's fine. But I think just having followers, people who follow your work isn't enough. You still need to set up a couple of those 5-minute face to face conversations. There's just nothing to replace it. And, we've been trying to find ways of replacing that for a really long time. And we know that that social connection is still essential and you can't outsource it to chatbot. You can't have generative AI do the communicating for you. It People can tell the difference. You won't pass the
Yeah.
Turing test. They'll be weirded out by it. And so be careful of those kind of like outsourcing interpersonal connection to another person, to generative AI or whatever. There's no kind of magical equation that will get you more followers that will necessarily convert to you the kind of success you want. You do actually have to form those actual human relationships. So I'm kind of staunchly in that corner, against sort of opting out of any kind of human connection, or just trying to outsource it just in an effort to get more followers.
That's huge. It's huge, and I like, if you need to press pause, rewind 30 seconds and listen to Dr. Tessa again. Like, that is the thing that so many, um, people who, especially when you go into a new area, a new discipline where you do not have the community. In my last book, Creative Calling, I spent one quarter of the book, 71 pages, literally
Yeah,
talking about building relationships. And especially, envy is such an ugly emotion. And I see so many people envious of the work of others, but it's sort of like you can't be disappointed at your work not getting traction when you haven't done the work to build the community. There's this,
yeah,
our expectations are completely out of whack with what we have actually, the work that we've put in. And there's something that feels very toxic by that. And I should say that this actually is, it goes both ways, right? If you're leaving, say, a more corporate situation, you're moving into an independent, artist, musician, writer universe, even as a hobby, the belief that your work is somehow just going to find its community and take off,
yeah,
that's fiction. And if you've been in one, an artist, you've been in one discipline, you can't expect equal, success in another. Or if you go back to a corporate universe, you've probably lost a few steps, or you're going to be out of
yeah,
sync. And why do we have this misplaced belief system around what works in one universe
yeah,
also is going to work in another one? Where does that
yeah.
where are we programmed for this disconnect?
So I think there's a lot going on. First, I
Mhm.
think that when we see people's success on social media, we see the tip of the iceberg. We have no idea what it took for those people to get all those followers, to get the New York Times to review their book, to place that, piece in kind of one of the top art galleries. We have no idea what it took, but we assume we know just because there's this kind of false transparency around what social media tells us is actually happening. And so we have false narratives around what it actually took for the person to get there. I think most of the stuff that I've managed to do successfully is because I ran into someone at a book event or something like that and had a 5-minute conversation that then kind of led into another thing. Does anyone know about any of that stuff? No, of course they don't. They just see the outcome, which is so and so blurbed my book or whatever the thing is. So I think that's one problem. We also forget, and I find this to be like a little bit funny because experts forget this too, that most of success doesn't come down to skills. It comes down to the hidden curriculum, knowing
Mm.
what the kind of parts of the job that no one talks about that aren't on websites that are required to get over a newcomer hump. And kind of one of the things urge people to ask during networking, and this is critical if you're going into a new career, is ask people who are successful but also who failed. Before I started this job, nobody told me that, and you can learn some of those lessons that they had, that so you don't walk into the same kind of mistake. And so for authors, we have these conversations all the time. Before I started this job, nobody told me that buying a bunch of Twitter followers from a Twitter farm won't actually sell your book, even though it kind of looks like it might. There's all these kind of false lures in careers that if we're not in it, we haven't been raised in it, we don't know not to follow. And that
Mhm.
little question can take you 5 minutes and you will learn a ton about a career, a ton about what's beneath the surface in that glacier of how someone got successful.
Yeah, this is, I think this is also why, see if you can follow me on this one. It might be a little bit obtuse, but this is also why the concept of tips and tricks are so seductive, because there's a belief that, someone gives us one tip and that's going to open the universe to us. Like,
Mhm.
if you are not in that world and you're looking to, like, what's not written on,
Yeah.
websites about how to become a successful photographer, designer, songwriter, author, entrepreneur. And, there's this sort of an addiction of, like, trying to find the next little thing that's going to, blow our world wide open. And yet, this is one of the things that was somewhat refreshing in your work is nowhere is there a chapter about shortcuts.
Nope.
I mean,
I don't believe in shortcut. Sorry,
right.
folks, you will not lose 10 pounds in a day, you will not get rich quick, and you will not find a new career by applying to 100 jobs in a week. It's just not happening.
Exactly. And yet we are still seduced by that. And, again, this, part of your work when you grapple with identity, not trying to do everything instead of focusing, not feeling recognized and or seen. Um, is there a prescription that you feel like is reasonably consistent across transforming from one job to another, from one industry to another, from one um, skill set to another? Is there some continuity that you can pin down for us?
Yep.
And we're not afraid of hard work. We're not afraid of long,
Yeah.
long arcs here. So just be
Yeah.
real with us. But how do we get away from this short, quick fix thing? And what are there some commonalities that if you're moving from one thing to another, what's the prescription?
Yes. So the first thing is walking into this, you need to let go of this feeling that you're going to have any sense of certainty before you start something new, that a light bulb will go off in your head and you will be ready. Um, Borrowing from the science of relationship breakups, that light bulb will not go off. You will not feel certain until you're pretty far along into the new thing. So don't wait for that kind of internal signal. S- You know,
Yes.
don't wait for the signal. It's never going to happen. You actually kind of need to onboard new things before offboarding the old thing. It's like dating while you're still married. You're still married to your career. You're going to start exploring these new things. Then from there, I think that I talk in my book about kind of the second stage after you've deep dived your own psychological existential problem. You need to learn what the new thing is like. 5 new conversations a week with people who are outside of your immediate social network. And this can include recruiters, hiring managers, people you don't know who are in a career that you're interested in. And I think the easiest thing you can do is just ask them for 10 minutes of their time, where you just ask them that question of, before you started this job, no one told me that. What you're doing here is you're looking for themes across, personal backgrounds, across companies, of what a career is actually like. And this, you don't need to commit to anything while you go through this process. But throughout the book, I just tell you, you need to have one on one conversations. Sometimes those network connections need to know each other, sometimes they don't, depending on your goals. And you're just all about collecting data on what you see. While you're doing that, you need to collect data on yourself. And I give you a couple quizzes that are simple to do. Things like, what's the difference between what you anticipate stressing you out in the morning and what actually stresses you out at the end of the day? Collect data on yourself that you think you already know about yourself, but you probably don't, because we have a lot of biases in memory and things like that. Knowing kind of what makes you tick, what frustrates you, those are key to kind of serving as a lens through which you view these one on one conversations. If someone starts talking about a stressor, something you didn't anticipate, but you noticed actually affects your sleep, and that keeps coming up over and over again in a new career, then that's telling you that's probably not going to be a good fit for you. These conversations are all about finding fit and doing them slowly, but you really only need to have, 5 a month, or a couple a week, to kind of start learning these things. There's a richness in one-on-one conversations that you're never going to get just from reading material. So break out of that idea that you can read a million books to learn something. You just simply can't. You have to talk to people.
My my phrase for that is, you can't learn this from the couch.
You
You know,
cannot. You're gonna
you
have to
cannot.
actually look at someone. I know people hate that. They're like,
They
"I can
do.
read all the productivity porn in the world. I can learn how to code." Doesn't matter. Talk to a hiring manager for 5 minutes. You will learn 10 times more in that 5 minutes about, like, their process for hiring, their sourcing. People told me all kinds of stuff I was shocked that they'd be willing to open
Mhm.
up about. They just really will. They love people love talking about themselves. So if you're nervous, just remember that one piece of advice.
So, I'm in a little bit of a pickle here, and, as someone who's coming from academia, and we're talking so much about getting real world experience, touching base with hiring managers or people who are full-time authors and learning from them, getting the feedback of the things that are not written in the books and not said on the internet, like the ugly underbelly, if you will.
Yeah.
Now that we can understand that. And yet, as someone who's coming from higher education has really struggled to present this information that you were talking about. It's not taught. I
Yeah.
mean, the fact that you are, an educator and are able to put a book out, like, I don't remember these classes being
No.
offered when I was in school. I mean, granted, it literally in the last century, so you have to take that for granted. But but, like, this is, again, what I love about your material. It's stating the thing that everyone's thinking and no one's talking about, but,
Yeah.
has formal education really dropped the ball on this one, and what do you prescribe? Because this is where people run to the names of institutions, or this is why they will
Yeah.
follow somebody on social media, but neither one of those actually has the answer. So tell us, is it true that they don't have the answer in academia?
Yeah.
And if so, like, how is it just looking for books like yours, or what's the solution there?
Yeah. In academia, we teach you facts. We don't teach you skills. And as a professor, I struggle with this all the time. How can I actually teach someone content and teach them a skill that is a real world skill at the same time? I think this is a huge struggle. When I teach undergraduates, I have to structure my courses around things like debates. So they learn the skill of talking to someone who disagrees with them. They learn the skill of arguing against their own self-interest. I teach, giving public presentations, but I am the exception, not the rule. And I think I've only kind of come around to this because I actually walked out of my PhD with very few of these skills. In fact, what I found is that the skills I learned selling men's shoes at Nordstrom's had greater utility to me taking leadership positions in academia than anything I learned in academia. And so I was just lucky that I grew up poor and I have had a job ever since I was 14 that taught me some of those skills. So I think that if you're feeling like you know a lot of things but you don't know how to actually communicate, you don't know some of these networking skills, you're in good company. But I think you can listen to people like me, you can read my book, but you have to practice. That is the
Mm.
only way you will get good at this. That's the only way that, like, I've learned how to write to the public or give a talk is through practice, practice, practice. And there is no way of sort of doing that passively. You have to be an active, kind of giver to the world of all of these kinds of skills, and you're going to be awkward and you're not going to like it, and you're probably going to get some failure feedback that's going to make you uncomfortable, but that's okay. That is literally the only way you're going to get good at this, is take the advice that people like me give you and don't just tell other people that advice. Actually have a 5-minute conversation. So everyone listening, this week have a 5-minute conversation with a stranger and see how it goes, and you'll get better at it, I think, over time. But that's really the only way you can do it, is by executing on that, not reading about it, not learning about it, no like bullet points.
I have shared before with our listeners that I just sent my next book off to the printer, and there is a whole chapter on practice because my belief is so radically aligned with what you've just said. There is a belief that we can intellectualize this and put all the bits in, or even in a digital world, or all the atoms in a real world in the right place, and that will
Mhm.
that will get us to fight the mob boss in the video game.
Yeah.
And it's just not true. You really
No.
are a collection of experiences, and this collection of experiences, the more you experience, the environment that you're training for, the better
Yep.
you get. And the
Yep.
reality is that, most people, if you have an able-bodied child, if your child falls down 4 times, you don't just say, "I guess my kid's not a walker." I mean, right? I mean, your kid has like literally walked around like a little drunk person for like months on end, and at some point, one foot becomes in front of another, and you let that last hand go, and then there's walking, and that's what is it about us that's so ego driven that
Yeah.
thinks that we are somehow free from this requirement? Is it a psychological, is it because we're seeing these shortcuts on what seem to be shortcuts on social media, and they don't exist in real life? Is there a psychological thing that's going on here? Why? Help
I
us.
think it's a combination of we're exposed to too many kind of get rich quick, metaphorically speaking, things out there
Yeah.
that tell you. I mean, I have an 11-year-old and he plays baseball and he thinks he can watch baseball all day and it will make him good at baseball. I tell him he just has to go out there and throw the ball for like 20 hours. That's
Yep.
the only thing. So there is that exposure. We're also in the most anxious stage of the world. I think Gen Z and millennials are suffering from social anxiety on these just insane levels. And so
Yeah.
we are motivated to avoid. We are motivated to be house goblins, to sit on our couch and to not put on pants because it's more comfortable. And I think that motivation, accompanied with just so much information being thrown at us that you can intellectualize expertise and not do it, I think is contributing. But kind of some of the first work I did as a social psychologist is studying people who are experts at things and what their bodies look like when they're doing the thing that they're good at. And we had baseball
Mm,
players, and we measured their physiology. And you can be in what's called a state of challenge, where you have the resources to cope with the demands of the situation. It's actual physiological state involving your blood pressure and your heart rate, or threat, where you're equally engaged, but your body's not actually giving you the resources you need. And down to a biological level, the people who have practiced, who are good at the thing, show a state of challenge physiologically when they're doing it. The people who haven't done that show a state of threat. And so the only way to get into that state of challenge is by practice. You cannot intellectualize it. Your body will not align with what you need it physiologically for you to be good at it unless you practice. So if you think you can kind of outsmart the practice, your body would tell you otherwise. And I'm talking about the below the neck blood pressure, heart rate, sympathetic arousal. Those systems only respond the way you need them to when you have practiced. And there's no way of outsmarting that.
and we're not talking just about baseball here and physical things. We're talking about emotional things. We're
Mental.
talking about, yeah,
Hmm.
mental things, like the ability to have a tough conversation with the client. Until you've had 50 difficult conversations with your clients,
Yep.
or you just cannot expect to be good at them. I hate this idea of effortless brilliance. And, most of the or some of the research that I tracked down referencing the work that I was writing on earlier is largely projected on the fact that in a previous village universe, hundreds of years ago, we would have seen someone with our own eyes, watch them start something, struggle, get better, struggle,
Yep.
get better. And now we understand why
Yep.
Jane the Gatherer is so good at gathering, or is so good at hunting, because we watched her practice hunting
Yep.
and we saw her get better. And now we see someone we've never heard of be the best in the world at fill in the blank, in, just because information travels so fast today. And we have then therefore ascribed somehow that is a possible path.
Yep.
And what I'm hearing from you is, neurologically, physiologically, this is not possible.
It's not possible. It's not possible. You can win the lottery. That's the only way to get rich quick, just by chance. And I think one thing we forget is that everything we do to get ahead is probabilistic. Any given one thing may or may not work out. As an author, any given podcast, any given op ed I write may lead to 500 books or zero. And you actually don't know, because the world is stochastic, what's going to hit and what's not. The only magical kind of solution is to do as much as you possibly can to practice and succeed. what the world sees is what's worked out. But in academia, we often talk about our reverse CV. It's a list of all the things we failed at, all the things we applied for and didn't get. And it's 50 times longer than the real one. But that's the one that we should actually be showing to people and be talking about if we want to have get real conversations about what it takes to actually get good at something, to succeed at something.
I love the reverse CV. I think it's like if you could see people's reverse CVs, could you imagine the increase in mental health, the increase in understanding, the increase in connection that we would have?
Yeah.
Oh, I love that. So, I'm pulling up a friend and someone who blurbed your book. He's been on the show before, Simone Stozoff, about the good enough job. So I loved my conversation with him because it was very oriented around, hey, look, your job isn't your identity.
Yeah.
And it was very heartfelt and earnest conversation. And yet we're so quick to just lean on titles because especially in a rather crass social, I'll call it American
Yeah.
conversation, what do you do is so superficial. So, is there space between the good enough job where we actually should disconnect our identity for what we do for a paycheck,
Yeah.
and your world where in job therapy, like we ought to actually embrace this. We ought to do work around our career and around our do work around our work so that we can get
Yeah.
comfortable with this. Like, are those two different perspectives at opposite end of a continuum? Or I guess describe that universe for us, as you will, if you will.
Yeah, I actually think that they fit together more nicely in my head than I think maybe other people's heads. But the reason why is because he talks about we are often chasing the wrong things in our careers. And,
Mhm,
some of those things are things like vanity titles, or, what I talk about in my book are high visibility roles that make us known to the CEO. These things
mhm,
that on the surface make us feel good about ourselves. And they're like getting a lot of likes on a tweet, which we have these endorphin rushes that are like kind of now evolved around oscillates and things like that.
mhm,
But at the end of the day, those things don't help your career progress. And I think a lot of the things he talks about people chasing are things like that, these kind of surface level um, public adoration, high visibility, prestige porn types of things that at the end of the day actually don't fit with what really makes us tick, what
mhm,
really makes us happy. And then critically in my book, what prevents us from getting into positions like the underappreciated star or the runner up. In fact, kind of one of the main reasons why people struggle to get the right kind of prestige is because they take on those things. They take on
mhm,
vanity titles. They take on high visibility roles where everyone knows their name, but their performance isn't associated with actually getting promoted, because those are like completely separate. And you got to figure out, like, you have to create those kind of separate lists. This stuff makes me feel good. It gives me a lot of metaphorical likes, but does it actually help me get ahead? Is it actually, giving me the real sense of purpose that I want? And it's very easy to chase those things because they're in front of us all the time. And corporations are getting really smart. They've upped their game with vanity titles, with C-suite titles to appeal to that. And I think that's where you're starting to kind of go in the wrong direction and chase the wrong things. You need to kind of pull back and not do all that high visibility crap, because it's not actually going to make you feel good or get ahead.
So here's my pitch to anyone who's listening on this book, why I would call it required reading. Most books that talk about this stuff do not help you understand why you are not happy. And through a series of prompts and questions and some research, some really clearly articulated takeaways from research, this does an amazing job at helping you understand what's missing and what you can get, how to find work that excites you, that fulfills you. So for just a moment of recognition and appreciation, thank you. It's very, very refreshing because most books are reluctant to take on that challenge. I'm guessing that's from all of your your doctorness that you learned all of these things, but to be able to package them is a real deal because so you mentioned the anxiety is an all-time high. The information's moving quicker than ever before, and that creates a lot of problems. And there is a lot, especially around work, identity, mental health. There's a lot of stuff going on right there. So thank you for writing something that was very cogent about helping people, helping one dissect this stuff because it's complicated. It has like family of origin all the way to like earning potential and everything in between. So if that's my pitch for the book. If that's interesting to you as a listener, then check out Dr. Tessa's work. The question for you, Dr. Tessa, is, and I feel like you've indicated that practice is really, even with your book, like the practice is required. Having said all this, are there things that you should definitely not do
Yes.
in this world? Like, you could argue that practicing, like if you do something you shouldn't do, then that's practice, and you really learn through practice that that doesn't work.
Yeah.
But are there just some things we ought to steer clear of, things that are not good for our mental health, things that won't get you where you want to go? I'm sure
Yeah.
you found something about that in your research, and I'm dying to know that.
Yes, there are lots of missteps. Biggest one out there right now is applying for a million jobs at one time. The easiest thing, the worst thing the internet has invented is the easy apply button. If you are uploading your materials to a portal and you have yet to talk to any hiring manager or any person at that organization when you do that, there's a pretty close to zero chance that your resume will actually rise to the top. I talk to a lot of people on the hiring side. They follow an equation to make sure that they have a really wide funnel. They get paid based on the width of this funnel, which means they get a lot of applications at the start. They put some search terms into LinkedIn Recruiter to narrow it down. They put in some more search terms. They take the job ad, they put it back up. They get some more people to apply. They go through all of this because they often get paid based on this process. But at the end of the day, the person they hire is almost someone whose name came to them through a friend, through a network connection, or through someone that they talked to who reached out to them and had a career conversation. At the end of the day, the way we hire is the way we've always hired. But we have all of this kind of information out there telling us to do this. And so if you're applying for 100 jobs a month and you're worried about why you're not getting a job, it's because you've applied for 100 jobs a month. So, first thing. Second thing, you have to absolutely create bespoke materials for jobs. And by that, I mean your resume should have parts of it that talk to each other, that make it clear how roles that you've had, how the overlap in those roles are relevant to the thing you're actually applying for. Do the work for the hirer. Don't expect them to connect those dots. Write those cover letters, just simple things that 90% of people don't do because they're submitting all the same stuff to one place. You will just immediately get knocked off. The first thing that most recruiters do is they remove people who have done that. So, bespoke materials. One other kind of little small piece of advice, if you have a bunch of kind of simultaneous roles on your resume that say through present, you better explain how those things actually overlap, or you're going to look like you are everywhere all at once. And that makes people nervous. That makes people anxious about your ability to actually kind of organize your work and to prioritize. So, more is not more, more is less. Integrate those things. These things all take work, but you should be applying for a couple jobs. You should be having a couple network conversations. Don't worry about, just throwing it all out there at one time. Take your time, slow down. And if you speak multiple languages, put that on your resume. People are afraid of doing that. There was this whole phenomenon called whitewashing resumes that the world went through where we thought we had to look as kind of white and American as possible. Little things like that, I think, actually go a long way.
I'm going to do a little bit of a lift here. The extension of what you just said about the corporate world, 100,000% applies to any individual creator. If you're trying to make work that appeals to everybody, it's going to appeal to nobody. If
Yeah.
you don't know who your clients could be, you haven't defined your ideal client, and you're not looking specifically for them with custom materials, you will not be successful. If you are not right, if you're writing a book and you're not writing a book, I like to write chapters and sections for an actual person. There's a person
Yeah.
in my mind that I'm picturing. And my belief is that in the particularized universe, so if one person has this problem, other people have this problem, but I'm not trying to do it for everybody, just like you wouldn't apply to 100 jobs at the same time.
Yeah.
The
Think about
wisdom,
what is
go
Sorry, go
ahead.
ahead.
Sorry. No, no,
I
you.
was just gonna say, think about who has a hair on fire problem that you are appealing to. Who has a real problem then there isn't a solution out there for, and that person has to be in your head when you're creating these things. And I love that
Yeah.
idea of I'm writing a book for a person. There's a human in my head, and I do the
Yes.
same.
It is. Yeah. To me, it takes again, because of information that tells us to do this, that, or because of a fear response, that if we try and appeal to everyone, that someone's going to find us and connect with us and love us and or hire us or whatever, and it's actually just the opposite. I was so struck by that part of your impassioned speech right there, and also the words in the book. So grateful that this exists. Thank you so much for your time and effort and commitment to putting this work out there in the world. Is there a place that you would direct us, other than we're very good at buying books and supporting authors. The book is called Job Therapy: Finding Work That Works for You. Doesn't matter if you're an independent artist or in the career corporate track. There's so much wisdom in here: how to identify the sources of your dissatisfaction, how to address them, how to align with your personal values and passions and purpose, how to, what questions to ask when you're leaning into a new client or trying to get a new job in a job interview. So much wisdom. Is there any place outside the book that you want us to go check out?
Sure. You can go to tessawestauthor.com, and some of the quizzes in the book, especially the opening
Yeah.
one about which type is you, you can take that quiz on my website. You'll get immediate feedback about, where you are, and along with some other quizzes on there. So tessawestauthor.com. If you're interested in my other identity as a scientist, you can go to tessawestlab.com for all of that academic work that we talked about.
Dr. Tessa West, thank you so much for being a guest on the show. We're big fans. We will support you in your new book. It's absolutely spectacular. Congratulations. And signing off from Dr. Tessa and myself, we hope you have an amazing day. Until next time.